My name is Iris Calloway. I'm 30 years old, and I remember the exact moment I realized my parents had sold something that wasn't theirs to sell, because a stranger's voice on the phone told me before my own mother ever did. Miss Calloway, I'm calling regarding the title transfer on a 2019 Ford F-150 previously registered to Marcus Reyes, the man said. There seems to be a discrepancy with the estate paperwork. Marcus was my fiancé. He died 14 months earlier on a rain-slicked highway outside Asheville, 3 weeks before our wedding. And the truck the man on the phone was asking about wasn't just a truck. It was the last thing of his I had left that still smelled like him if I sat in it long enough with the windows up. I hadn't given anyone permission to sell it. I hadn't even known it was gone. But to understand how my parents ended up selling my dead fiancé's truck without telling me, and why a lawyer was calling about it 14 months later, you need to understand what my family had become in the years since my brother's gambling problem stopped being a secret and started being a slow, quiet emergency that swallowed everything around it. I grew up in Hendersonville, North Carolina, the younger of 2 kids. My father, Walter Calloway, ran a small HVAC repair business. My mother, Joanne, kept the books for him and, more importantly, kept the peace in a household that increasingly needed peacekeeping as my brother Denny got older. Denny was 4 years older than me, charming in the specific way that made people forgive him things long after they should have stopped. He was smart, funny at parties, the kind of person adults liked instantly, and regretted trusting eventually. By the time he was 25, he had a gambling problem that our parents referred to, for years, as a rough patch. Even as the rough patch swallowed his car, his apartment deposit, and eventually a chunk of our parents' retirement savings that they never fully told me about until it was already gone. I was the stable one, the one who paid her own bills on time, kept a steady job as a paralegal at a firm in Asheville, dated Marcus for 4 years, before he proposed on a hiking trail overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains, with a ring he'd been saving for since our 2nd year together. Marcus worked as an electrician. Steady hands, steady heart, the kind of man who fixed things instead of talking about fixing them. We were 3 weeks from getting married when a truck crossed the center line on Highway 25 in the rain and hit him head-on. He died before the ambulance arrived. I found out standing in my kitchen, holding a phone that suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds, a police officer's careful, practiced voice, explaining something my mind refused to process for several full seconds. The truck the man on the phone would call me about 14 months later was Marcus's. A 2019 Ford F-150, gray, with a small dent in the tailgate from a job site incident he used to joke about, and a coffee stain on the passenger seat from our very first road trip together. After he died, his mother, Carol, a widow herself, gentle and grieving in her own quiet way, told me I should keep it. He'd want you to have something that still feels like him, she said, pressing the keys into my hand at the funeral reception. I didn't drive it often. It hurt too much some days. But I kept it registered in my name after his estate cleared probate, a simple process since Marcus had no other family beyond his mother, and Carol had signed everything over to me without hesitation, understanding better than most that grief doesn't follow anyone else's timeline. I parked that truck at my parents' house. That's the detail that matters here. I lived in a small apartment in Asheville with no dedicated parking, and my parents had a long gravel driveway and an old detached garage that hadn't housed a working car in years. My father offered to store it there until you're ready to decide what to do with it. And at the time, exhausted with grief, I said yes without thinking too hard about what storage might come to mean to 2 people who were, unbeknownst to me, drowning financially because of my brother. I visited that truck maybe once every few weeks. Sometimes I'd just sit in the driver's seat in my parents' driveway, engine off, hands on the wheel, remembering. I never suspected, not once, that the vehicle wasn't sitting exactly where I'd left it, exactly as I'd left it, the whole time. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. The man identified himself as Gregory Hahn, a paralegal at a title and escrow office, handling a used vehicle sale that had run into a snag. The buyer's bank had flagged a name mismatch during financing, since the truck's registration listed me as owner, but the seller who'd handled the transaction was my father. "I'm sorry, can you say that again?" I said, sitting down slowly at my kitchen table. "My father sold Marcus's truck? When?" "According to our records, the sale closed 6 weeks ago," Gregory said, "for $8,200. Is there an issue with the paperwork on your end, ma'am?" Because on ours, the seller signed as executor of an estate, but we don't have documentation showing that authority was ever formally established. I sat there with my mouth open for a long moment before I managed to say I'd need to call him back. I want you to understand something about the 6 weeks that had passed without me noticing. It wasn't because I was careless. It was because grief, real grief, the kind that follows you 14 months out from losing someone you were 3 weeks from marrying, doesn't operate on a schedule. Some weeks I visited my parents. Some weeks I didn't. Some weeks I couldn't bring myself to drive past the turn for their street at all, because the last time I'd made that drive with Marcus in the passenger seat, we'd been picking out wedding favors. I called my mother first. Her voice, when she answered, had the particular brightness she used whenever she already knew a conversation was going to go badly and was trying to get ahead of it. "Iris, honey, I was going to tell you," she said, before I'd even finished asking the question. "It's just, things have been so tight, and your father thought, since the truck was just sitting there—" "It was Marcus's truck," I said, my voice coming out flatter and colder than I expected. "It was registered in my name, legally mine. How do you sell something that isn't yours?" There was a pause, the kind that told me more than whatever words came after it usually would. "Your brother owed some very serious money," my mother finally said. "Not the usual kind, Iris. Some men came to the house. Your father was scared. We didn't know what else to do, and the truck was just sitting there, not being used." I asked her to explain what she meant by "some very serious money," and "men came to the house," and slowly, in pieces, over the next several minutes, a story came out that I hadn't known was happening at all, hidden from me the same way everything about Denny's problems had always been hidden from me, minimized, managed quietly by 2 exhausted parents who'd apparently decided somewhere along the way that protecting me from the truth was more important than telling it to me. Denny, it turned out, hadn't just racked up casino debt and sports betting losses over the years, the kind our parents had always vaguely alluded to. 8 months earlier, he'd borrowed money from a private lender connected to an illegal sports book operating out of Charlotte, the kind of lender who didn't send polite collection letters. When Denny couldn't pay, the debt had transferred, in the way these things apparently do, to a level of consequence that terrified my father badly enough that he'd paid an initial installment out of his own retirement account just to buy time. But it hadn't been enough, and when the lender's associates showed up at my parents' house one evening, not violent, but clearly not people to be ignored either, my father panicked and looked around for the fastest asset he could liquidate. He found it sitting in his own garage, a truck worth roughly $8,000 that, in his exhausted, frightened state, he apparently convinced himself was close enough to family property that selling it wouldn't really be stealing. He forged the executor authority, according to what Gregory Hahn later confirmed when I called the title office back, using outdated probate paperwork from early in Marcus's estate process, before Carol had formally signed the truck's ownership fully over to me. Paperwork my father had access to because he'd helped me with some of the initial phone calls during those first devastating weeks after Marcus died, back when I could barely function enough to hold a phone, let alone track every document that passed through the house. I sat with all of this for a long moment on the phone, my mother's voice going quiet on the other end, waiting for whatever I was going to say next. "You sold my dead fiancé's truck to pay off Denny's gambling debt," I said slowly, making sure I understood it myself, as much as making sure she heard it stated plainly. "Using forged paperwork. And you weren't going to tell me until a lawyer called me by accident. We were going to tell you eventually," my mother said, and I heard something crack slightly in her voice. Real fear underneath the deflection. "We just didn't know how, and things were so scary with those men. Iris, you don't understand what it was like. I understand that you had a choice," I said, "and the choice you made was to steal from me rather than tell me the truth and let me decide how to help, or not help, myself." I hung up before she could respond, which I'd never done to my mother in 30 years of being her daughter, and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time afterward, staring at nothing, feeling something shift inside my chest that felt less like anger and more like a door, quietly, permanently closing. I called Carol the next morning. Marcus's mother deserved to know what had happened to the truck she'd given me, the truck her son had driven to job sites for 3 years, and I owed her honesty even though the conversation terrified me. Carol was quiet for a long moment after I explained everything. Then she said something I didn't expect. "Iris, I need to tell you something too. When I signed that truck over to you, my lawyer had me sign a secondary document as well, one you may not know about, because Marcus specifically requested it before the wedding, back when he was updating his own affairs before the accident." I asked her what she meant. "Marcus set up a small trust," Carol said carefully. "Life insurance through his union, plus some savings, meant to be combined and held for you specifically, separate from anything that would pass through a standard estate process, because he told me, and I remember this clearly, that he didn't entirely trust how quickly certain people in your family moved when money was involved. He never said your parents' names directly, but he made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I'd make sure that money went to you directly, through a trust, not through any process your family could interfere with." I felt something cold move through me, hearing that. Marcus, 3 weeks before our wedding, already protecting me from a family dynamic he must have sensed more clearly than I'd ever let myself see, even after 4 years together. Carol had been managing that trust quietly for 14 months, waiting for what she called the right time to bring it up, since grief made everything complicated and she hadn't wanted to add legal paperwork to my plate while I was still learning how to breathe without him. The trust held just over $31,000, entirely separate from the truck, entirely untouched by anything my parents had done. That wasn't the point of the money. Not really. Not in the way it might sound. The point was that Marcus had seen something coming, some version of exactly what had just happened, and had quietly built a wall around at least one piece of what he wanted me to have, specifically because he suspected my family might reach for anything left unprotected. I hired a lawyer of my own the following week, a sharp civil attorney named Devin Ashcroft, and explained the entire situation: the forged executor documentation, the unauthorized sale, the $8,200 that had gone toward paying off my brother's illegal debt without my knowledge or consent. Devin was direct with me. What my father had done constituted vehicle theft and document fraud, both of which carried real legal consequences, regardless of family relationship or good intentions. I had every right to pursue criminal charges, or at minimum, a civil claim to recover the value of the truck plus damages. I sat with that option for a long time. Part of me wanted to walk into that title office and let the full weight of what my father had done land exactly where it belonged. But another part of me, the part that had spent 30 years being the stable one, the reasonable one, the one who managed conflict quietly instead of escalating it, wanted a resolution that didn't require watching my father face criminal charges over a truck, even one that had meant more to me than almost anything else I owned. I settled on something in between. Devin drafted a formal demand letter, outlining the fraud clearly, along with a deadline for repayment of the full sale amount, plus a modest additional sum, reflecting the emotional and legal complications my parents had caused, with an explicit statement that failure to comply within 30 days would result in a formal police report and civil suit. I delivered that letter myself, sitting once again at my parents' kitchen table, a location that seemed to keep hosting the worst conversations of my adult life. My father read it in silence, his hands trembling slightly by the time he reached the last page. My mother cried, the kind of crying that came from fear rather than remorse, at least at first. "You'd really do this to your own father," he said finally, not quite meeting my eyes. "Over a truck. You sold my dead fiancé's truck using forged documents to pay off a debt my brother created through illegal gambling," I said. "This isn't about the truck anymore. It's about the fact that you were willing to commit fraud against me rather than have an honest conversation. And it's about the fact that if I hadn't gotten a phone call by accident, I still wouldn't know." I told them about Marcus's trust, about Carol, about the fact that he'd apparently anticipated exactly this kind of situation and quietly built protection around it long before any of us knew he'd need to. I watched my father's face change when I said that, something that looked almost like shame finally breaking through the fear. My parents paid the full amount within the 30-day window, liquidating a small portion of what remained of their retirement account, the same account my father had already drained once, trying to protect Denny from consequences that, in the end, landed on me instead. Denny called me once, about 2 weeks after everything came out into the open. He apologized, in the vague, deflecting way he always apologized for things, more focused on how bad he felt than on what the actual damage had been. I told him I appreciated the call, and I meant it, but that I needed distance from the entire situation for a while, him included. He didn't argue. I think some part of him understood, finally, that this had gone further than any previous rough patch ever had. It's been 7 months since that phone call from Gregory Hahn changed everything. I used part of the settlement, combined with the trust Marcus had quietly built for me, to put a down payment on a small house outside Asheville, the kind of place Marcus and I used to talk about buying together someday, before someday got taken away from both of us on a rainy highway. My relationship with my parents is different now, careful and distant in a way that still aches some days, especially around holidays, when the empty space where trust used to sit becomes harder to ignore. I talk to my mother occasionally. My father and I have barely spoken beyond logistics since that afternoon at the kitchen table. Carol and I are closer than ever, in the strange way grief sometimes builds unexpected family, where blood family fails you. We have dinner most weeks now. She tells me stories about Marcus as a boy, and I tell her about the version of him I got to know as a man, and somewhere in between those stories, we've both found something like comfort neither of us fully expected. I bought a new truck eventually, nothing fancy, gray, similar enough to feel familiar without feeling like I was trying to replace something irreplaceable. I keep it parked outside my own house now, where nobody else has a key, where nobody else can decide, on my behalf, what it means or what it's worth. Sometimes I think about that call from Gregory Hahn, about how close I came to never knowing the truth at all, about how a bank's routine paperwork flag ended up unraveling something my own family had been careful enough to hide from me for 6 full weeks. And I think about Marcus, 3 weeks before our wedding, quietly setting something aside because some part of him already understood what I hadn't let myself see clearly yet. That love, in my family, had always come with fine print I'd never bothered to read. He read it for me, and even after he was gone, he made sure I'd still have something left that nobody else could sell out from under me without my knowledge, ever again.